This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the topic is Martin Scorsese, American filmmaker. His life and career will be under review with two experts, and the conversation will begin in a moment. I am speaking with Marshall Fine and Mark Raymond about the career of Martin Scorsese, the American filmmaker. Marshall is a film critic. He has his own website, which I will link to. It's called HollywoodandFine.com. And he has written about the career of Martin Scorsese and his films. Marshall, welcome. If you could give a little bit of background about yourself and what drew you to the work of Scorsese.
Well, I've been a film critic for roughly 40 years. I spent 25 years working for the Gannett newspapers. Now I'm the critic for Star Magazine. As you said, I had a website, Hollywood and Fine. I really no longer sort of add to that except when I'm going to film festivals to basically keep my press credential up. But I have been a Scorsese fan since I reviewed Mean Streets when it first came out, and have followed his career as a critic ever since. Met him in the, I believe I met him with Goodfellas, and he subsequently actually gave me a blurb for a biography I wrote of John Cassavetes. So I've been an admirer of his work from the beginning.
And Mark Raymond has written a book on Martin Scorsese called The Making of Martin Scorsese. Mark, what other things have you done in regard to Scorsese, and how did you first encounter his work?
Well, I first encountered his work as basically as a student. I wasn't really a huge film fan as a young person, and when I was in university and I started to get into film generally and reading people like Roger Ebert and those kind of critics, Jonathan Rosenbaum, I started to get into Scorsese's work at that time. And then I pursued a graduate degree in film studies, master's degree, and then eventually a PhD. And Scorsese was the director I chose to write about. And so for the book I published, which is called Hollywood's New Yorker, The Making of Martin Scorsese, it was basically an extension of my dissertation work on Scorsese. And I guess the early films, like Mean Streets and Taxi Driver, were the ones that I first sort of attracted me to Scorsese and his work, and then kind of all of his subsequent work, where basically in the early 90s is when I first started to follow his career as it was kind of happening and kind of going forward.
Well, Scorsese was born, I believe, in the early 40s, and he grew up in New York City. Maybe, Mark, I should direct this to you first, since maybe you've written about a little bit about his youth in your book. But I know famously he was influenced by a lot of the Italian and European films, which by the time he was just a boy were first coming to American shores after the war. Can you talk a little bit about Italian neorealism and its effect on the young Scorsese as a filmgoer?
Yeah, well, Scorsese talks about this in his quite wonderful documentary, My Voyage to Italy. And he talks about sort of seeing these Italian films actually first on television, and often in very bad kind of copies or really rough prints. But yet he talks about in this documentary that the power of those films was such that it still kind of came through. And yeah, Scorsese kind of comes about, as you mentioned, he's born in 1942, and he comes about in New York City, comes of age in the 1950s. And that's a great time, of course, for European art cinema, and especially if you happen to live in New York, there's the access to those films. And of course, there's, Hollywood of the 1950s as well. And those are kind of equal kind of influences. He's made, of course, a 4-hour documentary not only on Italian cinema but also on American cinema, as he's gotten sort of established as this great director. He's also become this kind of film historian. And in my book, I don't actually go into the childhood as much, but I definitely talk about the importance of the fact that he grew up in New York at this particular time in film history. And then eventually, in the 1960s, he goes to NYU. He studies film production kind of formally, gets an MFA in film, which leads actually to his first feature film. Who's That Knocking at My Door? And he even actually teaches at NYU for a brief time as an instructor in the late 60s as well. And so that kind of background, so that actually forms the first chapter of my book, is on Scorsese and the university specifically.
Marshall,
I also just been here long enough just to say, I think that also a real contributing factor was the fact that he was a sickly kid. He had asthma. He spent a lot of time at home, basically couldn't play with other kids. And so his window on the world was the window that he had out onto the street of his parents' house in Little Italy and the television. And this is how, and so he couldn't play with kids. And so he spent all of his time sort of basically in his head, either watching what was going on out on the street and making up stories in his head, or watching these films on television. And this, I think, was a real shaping factor.
Yeah, one thing that I do want to mention is that, like Francis Ford Coppola, who's I think a couple of years older, he's most associated with these mafia type films, but where Coppola had no interaction with, say, inner city gangster types. While Scorsese wasn't involved in any illegal activity, as far as he ever said, he did grow up around these people in the Little Italy area. What degree do you think that growing up in that portion of New York had an effect on some of his later films, specifically some of the New York-based films?
I think that it was a huge influence. I mean, as they always say, artists, you write what you know, and even if he wasn't involved, he was in the environment and soaked that all up. Knew people who were, it was his neighborhood. Everybody, what's going on in your neighborhood, and you absorb that. And so I think that was a big influence.
Mark?
Yeah, and as Marshall mentioned, the fact that he was a sickly kid and things like that meant that he was often the observer, right, as opposed to being, so he wasn't maybe actively involved, but he got used to being the person who was kind of the person who was almost like recording in his brain maybe these stories or remembering these incidents in order to later kind of put them on the film. So it's almost like those early scenes in Goodfellas where you have the character looking out, the Henry Hill character looking out the window and looking at these gangsters. I think that was a lot of Scorsese's feeling, is that he wasn't directly involved, but he was hearing these stories, and not only that, he had, of course, a brother as well who would tell him these stories. He would hear stories from his father and his uncles. He talks a little bit about his uncle, I think his father's brother, who was a bit of an inspiration for the Johnny Boy character in Mean Streets, this kind of guy who was constantly in trouble, who his father was trying to help out. So all of those things, of course, go into not only the early films, but like you say, just the general kind of New York films that he would make throughout his career.
Well, the first New York film was mentioned, Who's That Knocking at His Door? And even though De Niro, in the first half or the early part of Scorsese's career, is thought of as the actor most identified with Scorsese, and then DiCaprio's had some 6 or 7 films now with Scorsese. Really, Harvey Keitel was really the first guy that appeared in some of the earlier films of Scorsese. And this is the first one that he appears in, and it's also his first role. He plays a young Catholic guy and trying to romance this girl. And it's got some moments, it's got some interesting moments. Was this a student film that he expanded into a feature film?
Yeah, I believe that was the case. And that, Harvey Keitel was this young former Marine who was working as a court reporter, took an acting class and sort of found his voice. Harvey Keitel was this very conflicted young man, and here was Martin Scorsese, who was also a very conflicted young man who had thought about going in the seminary and then decided not to, and went to the Church of Cinema instead. But that conflict that is present in Who's That Knocking at My Door and in Mean Streets, that whole idea of living the sort of the spiritual life versus the physical life, and which should take precedence. And so that, I think, was, and that was one of the themes in the student film that turned into Who's That Knocking at My Door.
Uh-huh.
began again as almost, I believe it began as Scorsese's master's kind of project for his MFA, and then eventually it kind of got expanded out. His teacher at NYU, Haig Manoogian, took an interest in Scorsese and believed Scorsese was this very talented filmmaker, and helped actually produce this film and turn it into this kind of feature. It has actually many different names. So it was, I believe, I Call First was the first title. Then it was called Bring On the Dancing Girls. And then eventually, I believe it was even called JR at one point, which is based on the lead character's name. And then eventually, Who's That Knocking at My Door? And yeah, it's an interesting film to look at. I mean, it has similarities with Mean Streets, for sure. The narrative is often told that Mean Streets is kind of the more mature, kind of refined version of Who's That Knocking at My Door. Yeah. But actually, I think if you look at Who's That Knocking at My Door, there's a lot of really interesting things in it. It's more of an experimental film. It's kind of it isn't quite as polished, but I think there's a lot to appreciate in the movie. And especially, he was very lucky, of course, to get somebody like Harvey Keitel for the lead role. Or even in that first film, I think you see how talented Keitel is as a performer.
Yeah, it's always reminded me of the first, two of the first three Kubrick films, The Killing and Killer's Kiss. It has that kind of rough quality, but you can see strains that would later come to fruition in some of the later, better films. Then there's like a 4 or 5 year period where he doesn't make a film, and then he gets Boxcar Bertha with AIP, the Roger Corman and Sam Arkoff outfit. And this is just really just a generic kind of easy, quick money film backed by Corman. Is there anything of Scorsese in that film that you guys could see?
Well, not really. And in fact, he was sort of an acolyte of John Cassavetes, and met Cassavetes and showed him Boxcar Bertha when he finished it. And Cassavetes watched it and then turned to him with a smile and said, "So, you've just spent a year making a piece of shit. Why don't you do something that's personal, that means something to you?" And that was a real revelation, I think, to Scorsese, that in fact you can make a commercial movie and still have it be something personal, and not have it be, sort of a genre knockoff thing like Boxcar Bertha.
Yeah, I mean, there is I guess, hints at Scorsese's later films in terms of, well, the crucifixion sequence at the end of that film, where the character is crucified against a boxcar. Even some of the shots, he kind of repeats some of that with The Last Temptation of Christ when he eventually films that crucifixion scene. So there's small things in there, but it's very much a film of the time. It's this kind of genre film. It's playing off of the success of Bonnie and Clyde. It's kind of a knockoff there. I should also add,
and Bonnie and Clyde was 1968, and this is 4 years later, so it shows you just how far removed a knockoff it is.
Yeah, it's like 5 years later, sort of down the line. I want to also to mention, just briefly, there is actually a film he made in 1970 while at NYU called Street Scenes 1970. And he's really more of the kind of the producer of the film, or the person who kind of edited the film together. It's basically a film that's documenting the protests that were going on that happened both after the bombing of Cambodia and then the shootings at Kent State that happened in May 1970. This film's kind of out of circulation now. I know Scorsese has a copy, but he doesn't really allow, or it's very hard to get access to actually screen it. I know I tried to while I was researching my dissertation, and to no avail. And actually, I write about this film in my book a little bit, because it's kind of it kind of shows that Scorsese, and I think Boxcar Bertha does this as well, they're kind of more political films than overtly political films. Boxcar Bertha has this kind of union kind of theme in it as well. And Street Scenes 1970, again, it's made by a lot of students and even some professional filmmakers like Don Lenzer, the cinematographer, worked on the film. And it played at the New York Film Festival in 1970. It actually got pretty good notices there, but then Eventually, there was sort of controversy over the authorship of the film because it was this kind of collaboration, but Scorsese's name got put on as director, even though he was more of an editor-producer. And so, and I think the experience, Scorsese's talked about the experience a couple times, but he doesn't bring it up very much, especially anymore. But he was kind of discouraged with the experience, and then shortly afterwards, he ended up leaving New York and NYU and teaching, and went to California to work on, I believe the film was Medicine Ball Caravan, which was like a...
Medicine Ball Caravan was like a rock documentary after Woodstock. He notoriously is famous for having been one of the cameramen at Woodstock and being the only one in a coat and tie at Woodstock.
Yeah, and he helped edit the film as well. Woodstock is like key to that. Yeah, and so eventually, he kind of leaves that behind. He makes Boxcar Bertha, and like Marshall said, the conversation with Cassavetes is now kind of legend in Scorsese's biography, where Cassavetes kind of said, "Yeah, it's for what it is, it's good, but it's ultimately a piece of shit. Make something personal." And that's when he went back to a script he had. I think it was called Season of the Witch at the time, and he basically started reworking that, and also like collaborated a little bit with his then girlfriend Sandy Weintraub, who was the daughter of Fred Weintraub, who actually brought Scorsese to work on Medicine Ball Caravan, and she basically advised him to add more of the personal stories that he would tell her about his childhood, about the stories he learned growing up, and he put more of that into the script and de-emphasize the religious aspect a little bit.
Yeah, and Mean Streets is certainly Cassavetes' influence. It also reminds me a lot of pre-Godfather Pacino films like Panic in Needle Park. It has that early 70s New York zeitgeist down pat, and it's basically the story of the Harvey Keitel character and this Johnny Boy character played by De Niro, who is sort of like Tonto and Lone Ranger, except that Johnny Boy's all fucked up. So how is that film upon release? That's really when I guess Scorsese put his real imprint and became known as an up-and-comer, I guess.
I'd say, yeah, that his name was known. I don't think that the film was itself a commercial success, but it got noticed by critics, and his name got noticed. It was completely different than other things that were coming out at that time. It was sort of the anti-Godfather, in that the Godfather was, epic and romantic and sweeping, and this was gritty and on the street, and just had a lot of profanity and what seemed like improvisation. And this sort of manic energy that De Niro brought to it, that nobody had seen before. At that point, nobody knew who De Niro was. I mean, he put out Mean Streets the same year he was in the film Bang the Drum Slowly, and which were two very different films. And prior to that, he'd been working with Brian De Palma on comedies. Two different ones. One called Greetings, another one called Hi Mom, I believe.
Yeah.
And so he was, essentially sort of known as a comic actor. He'd also been in a bad film based on a book called The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight. So he was a revelation that year. That was sort of De Niro's launch year, 73, with those two films. And Mean Streets was unlike anything people had seen other than, as you said, sort of the Cassavetes films. A lot of people talking, with character being revealed through the dialogue as opposed to the action. The act was not a particularly action-packed film. If you watch that movie now, you'd be surprised just how talky it is.
Yeah, and and it really came about only because of a very particular moment in American film history in 1973. It was made, it was distributed by Warner Brothers. It was kind of made independently but picked up and by John Calley, who took a chance on a lot of kind of unusual films, unusual projects that were kind of getting, the 70s are full of these films that, you watch now and you kind of wonder how they got financed, how they got made, because they seem so uncommercial. And like Marshall mentioned, Mean Streets wasn't a popular success, but it certainly was a critical success. It got a lot of very, people like Pauline Kael especially gave it a very big rave, and it kind of made Scorsese this kind of hot director, allowed him to make to be hired by Warner Brothers again the next year for Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which was a more high-profile project and with a big star in Ellen Burstyn. And it sort of, yeah, so it does kind of establish Scorsese's kind of critical reputation, and it's very kind of key there. It's also personally, like, probably still my favorite Scorsese film. It's the one that I've watched the most, and it had this very, and again, I think it was watching it as a somebody in their early 20s when I first encountered the film, and it had this really, I had a real personal connection to it, and then subsequently wanted to keep kind of watching it to sort of analyze it more, and it does have that Cassavetes influence for sure. But what I like about the film is that it also brings more genre elements, but kind of mixes them together in a way Cassavetes really didn't do. Cassavetes was much more a straight kind of try to get at this realist drama for the most part. Scorsese's bringing in influences from the musical, from film noir, from gangster films, even from kind of buddy films, the relationship between Charlie and Johnny Boy. So all of those kind of aspects I found quite fascinating. And I actually wrote an article that was published like many years ago now, but where I try to kind of get at these different genre influences in the film.
Yeah, I grew up in New York City in a very mafia-infested kind of neighborhoods, and I've always sort of cringed when I hear people talk about Goodfellas or Casino being realistic mafia films. They are just as they're sort of MTV gangsters. Whereas if you look at Mean Streets, that's the way most of the gangsters really were. The two films that I've always said were the best gangster films in portraying realistic gangsters are actually, I think, Jim Jarmusch's Ghost Dog, and then actually, I think the greatest American gangster film ever made is Cassavetes' Killing of a Chinese Bookie. And Mean Streets is right there in terms of the realism of the characters. A lot of these guys aren't that bright. They're kind of, what's a mook? That kind of thing. Whereas when you see the highly stylized, highly polished gangsters of Goodfellas, that's just as unrealistic as the Shakespearean Coppola gangsters. But then he does, as you mentioned, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, which later became the basis for the sitcom Alice, which was a successful show. And while that's a good film and it has good actors, there's something, it's almost as if this explosion that ends at Mean Streets is all of a sudden repressed, and you get this story of this sort of woman who doesn't know what she wants to do, is struggling through life, and it seems almost an anti-Scorsese film in some way. Was this something that, as you said, was a project given to him? This wasn't really a personal Scorsese film, was it?
Why don't you go ahead, Dan?
You mean Mark?
Sorry, Mark.
Sure. Yeah, it was written. It was written by Robert Getchell. It was a project Ellen Burstyn was wanted, like basically was got off the ground. She wanted to. She had the script, wanted to make this film, and decided to work with Scorsese. I mean, there's a famous. I think she asked Scorsese, what do you know about women? And Scorsese said, nothing, but I'm willing to learn, or I want to learn. And that was enough to get her the kind of the job from Burstyn. She really liked that answer, apparently. And I think there are influence. I think you can see it as a Scorsese film, even though the subject matter is quite different. There's a really nice, great opening sequence that I really like. That's a kind of throwback to the old Hollywood films. It has like the kind of Wizard of Oz kind of feel to it in terms of going back to the character's childhood, and you have the influence of popular music that Scorsese uses very well throughout the film, and you have a really great performance, a brief performance but an explosive one from Keitel as well as this very frightening kind of boyfriend she encounters. And so I think there are, and Scorsese has said there's the main relationship is between the Ellen Burstyn character and her son, and he felt he tried to put a lot of his own relationship with his mother, which you actually see in some of Scorsese's later work, especially the film he makes the same year, a documentary called Italian American about his parents, and you get a real indication of Scorsese's relationship with his mother, this kind of joking relationship they have, which you see, I think, in the relationship between Alice and her son in Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore. So I do think there is some of Scorsese there, even though it's clearly more of a commercial project, one that didn't originate with him. But I think he was quite anxious to take on that kind of project too, because Scorsese's always admired Hollywood filmmakers and people who, these kind of studio directors who would take on these projects that weren't theirs, but they would still put their own personality into them. Out of the sort of the auteur theory that Scorsese was a big fan of, like as a student and as a. I've talked to some people who were students of Scorsese's at NYU, and they definitely said the influence of Andrew Sarris, and particularly Sarris's book, The American Cinema, was very much a book Scorsese read and that Scorsese admired and really kind of followed. So I think he was, quite excited to do this kind of work, and of course, further establish himself as a named director, so he could make maybe more personal projects going forward.
And I think that if he had not made Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, he couldn't have made Taxi Driver, because Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore was a big commercial success. It was not recognized as quote unquote a Martin Scorsese film as films subsequently would be, but it showed that here was this young guy who had made this really raw, unusual film in Mean Streets, and now here he is doing a mainstream Hollywood film, albeit one with his own sensibility and certainly a more modern sensibility than the films of the 40s and 50s that Hollywood turned out. But it was obviously a commercial piece of filmmaking by someone who knew what he was doing and won an Oscar for Ellen Burstyn as Best Actress. So, that kind of thing gives you credibility, gives you commercial credibility, so you can go ahead and make something as startling and original as Taxi Driver was.
Which brings me to the Jodie Foster. That was, I think, it might not have been her actual first film role, but it's the first film role where she has more than just a walk-on role. And I think she did a few TV performances, like on The Partridge Family or something. And then she later, a couple of years later, with the release of Taxi Driver, she becomes Jodie Foster after that. And Taxi Driver, along with Raging Bull and Goodfellas, are sort of the big three films that people point to as the one. They're always named, if they say, what's the greatest Scorsese film? It's usually one of those three films. And this had the script rewritten by Paul Schrader, and everything seems to come together in that film. And, there's really, I don't think much that you can point out that's really wrong with the film. New York, I don't think had ever been portrayed in such a dreamy or nightmarish Stygian way. The opening and closing shots of the taxi coming in and out of this fog, Marshall, I guess if you want to start off there, I mean, it's one of those things where it's, I think, the right film at the right time. Would you say?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's 1976. This one came out, I think, shortly after Robert Altman's Nashville as well. I mean, this is really an incredibly fertile time in terms of Hollywood films and the people of sort of the film school generation, by which I mean Coppola, Scorsese, Spielberg. Robert Altman wasn't a film school guy, but his films also, he was one of there was all these mavericks who got to make movies at this sort of crease in time because the studio system had sort of broken down at the end of the 60s. Easy Rider was a hit. Everybody thought, well, gee, these young people are going to movies. We need young people to make movies. And so movies like Mean Streets and then subsequently Taxi Driver get made. Taxi Driver, you got to remember, 76 was a brutal year in New York. New York, had a blackout. There was the headline on the Daily News, Ford to New York, drop dead. The city was, seemingly coming apart at the seams with drugs, with race, with crime, whatever you want to. The worst nightmare that you can think of. That was what New York was being portrayed as, and here was Scorsese showing someone who seemingly was a normal person being driven crazy by this particular moment in society. It's hard to imagine just how shocking this film was at the time, particularly the finale, that final shootout. in spite of the fact that he desaturated the color, it's still, at that moment, with the exception of, I would say, maybe the Wild Bunch, one of the most shocking shootout finales, as graphic as anything had ever been at that point. And, yeah, absolutely perfect. It is a great movie, and it does absolutely capture that time. You go back and watch it now, and it's like seeing a time capsule of New York City in 1975, 1976. Plus, he had a great cast. I mean, aside from De Niro and Harvey Keitel and Jodie Foster, he had Albert Brooks, he had Sybil Shepherd. It was a fascinating cast, a fascinating film. It's still, to me, probably his best.
Yeah. Mark?
Yeah, I think that's it's become, I think, probably amongst film critics recognized as his greatest film. I think filmmakers maybe still prefer Raging Bull because of how technically brilliant that film is.
Yeah.
But I think with Taxi Driver, it's really a film that you can go back and watch again and again and find new meanings. And it's one of those films too that you can read. People keep writing things about it, and it's almost like you feel like, well, I know everything there's been so much written about Taxi Driver, I can't possibly read anything new, but yet I still do every year. It seems like every couple of years there's a new piece, and I go, oh, there's more. And I think that really shows the richness of the film as a text, and I think it's probably going to allow the film to become this maybe the great American film of the 70s, in the same way as like a movie like Vertigo or a movie like The Searchers have become the great American movies of the 50s. I think partly just because they're so critic friendly. Like, there's so much you can read into the films. There's so much depth to the films, and I think Taxi Driver has that kind of quality to it. And you mentioned Dan, the film almost like a film that is above criticism, but the film has kind of its critics as well. I know Jonathan Rosenbaum has always been bothered by the racial dynamics of the film, and some other critics as well, especially the fact that the character Harvey Keitel plays the pimp was originally meant to be African American, written as such, and then Scorsese and Schneider basically decided it would be too controversial and might cause riots. They thought it would be irresponsible but at the same time it kind of downplays the racism of the film, or the race, not racism of the film, but the racial motivations of the character. And I think it may have actually led, because the film also Scorsese tells the story of going to see the movie and being kind of shocked that people were kind of cheering the violence at the end. That they were actually identifying with this character who was clearly, I think, meant to be considered kind of insane, as somebody who you were meant to identify with at the beginning, but then gradually realize, to be distanced from. But it's unclear if that distance was really achieved. And I think if you had the character be African American, at the end, the racial motivations may have been more kind of clear, and it might have been the critique of this kind of right-wing vigilante mentality that I think was kind of intended in the film. Like, because basically, it's not an accident that Travis gets a 45 Magnum pistol, right? Because that's the Dirty Harry gun, and he wants to be a Dirty Harry kind of figure. But again, the film, I think, is trying to kind of critique that mentality. It's unclear, though, if it actually worked that way with audiences.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like a death wish, but a literate death wish. Now, I want to talk about the De Niro character for just a moment, because he had won, De Niro, his first Oscar for Godfather 2, and I recently rewatched the film, and while it's a good film, I just shake my head with people who say that it's better than the first film, because you look at the whole flashback De Niro sequence, and it's utterly pointless. De Niro there's no real De Niro in there. He's basically doing a Brando impression. And then you look at Taxi Driver, and this is so much superior performance. Yes, it was 2 years later it qualified, but De Niro here should have won an Oscar for this. And he's often called a psychopathic character. And in my review of the film, I say, this is utterly ridiculous. He's in no way, shape, nor form a psychopath. He's a borderline personality, and that's why you identify with him. If he was a psychopath, he wouldn't have any set of ethics. He's clearly motivated by an ethos. It could be a warped ethos, certainly is, but he's not a psychopath by any way. And the very reason you're drawn to him is because you might have known someone like this. He could have been someone you worked with. He could have been someone sitting next to you on a bus or a subway. And you want, just, it was, less than a decade later, Bernard Goetz became famous as the subway shooter in a very similar kind of thing. And it's that performance, that kind of likable performance. There's that famous scene too, where after the porno film with Sybil Shepherd, where he's trying to call her, sending her flowers, and the camera looks away from it. And I think it was Scorsese who said that that's the most painful scene in the whole film, and it really is, because you can hear that she's bullshitting him, basically telling him, get away from me or whatnot, and you just hear his end of the conversation. And there's so many little moments like that in that film. Either one of you, do you think that this is De Niro's best performance as an actor?
Well, it's certainly one of them. And it's not a surprise that the film didn't win Oscars. The surprise was that it was nominated for Oscars because it was considered so controversial, so sensational at the time. And that, I believe, I blank on Oscar history, but I believe it lost to Rocky. Am I correct? Yeah.
Yes.
Rocky, the ultimate uplift film.
Yeah.
This is, Taxi Driver is the ultimate downbeat film. So, this is, here you are in the middle of the 70s. Watergate is over. The Vietnam War has just ended. We want a movie that's going to give us uplift, like Rocky, that shows that the underdog does win. We're not going to give this award to Taxi Driver, which is, downbeat. We're not going to give it to Network, which is telling us that the media is basically playing us in a movie that was so prescient that it's coming true right now. No, we're going to give it to Rocky. We're not going to give it to Bound for Glory about how badly we treated poor people in the Depression. We're going to give it to Rocky. So no, I think that. But to answer your question, I think it is one of his best performances. I don't know if it's the best because he was still such a young actor and he's really matured and can give amazing performances these days too, although he seems to be choosing mostly paycheck roles these days.
Yeah, so I think it's my favorite. This one and another Scorsese role in The King of Comedy is Rupert Pupkin. I think those are my two favorite Scorsese or De Niro performances. And this one, he does get, like you mentioned, Dan, he definitely is not a psychopath because because a psychopath is somebody without empathy.
Yeah.
And whatever you want to say about Travis's character, he feels, right. He has
it's his biggest weakness.
He has. He just doesn't know. And again, I think his mentality has been shaped by, the popular culture, and that's also why. There's that famous scene. The most famous scene of the film, of course, the "You Talking to Me" scene, where he's in the mirror, and of course, there he's playing a role. He's playing a cowboy or a cop who's confronting, the bad guy, as he had seen in so many kind of movies. And that scene points to also De Niro's greatness as a performer. That sequence was largely improvised. It's not in the script. The script basically simply says Travis talks to himself in the mirror. There's no dialogue. Scorsese and De Niro kind of worked on that scene in rehearsals and eventually shaped it into the scene it became. And there's also, a great scene, a couple of other great scenes where you really see De Niro. The scene outside the taxi stand or outside the restaurant, with the taxi, his fellow cab driver, played by Peter Boyle, and where Travis is trying to he basically knows he's going to do something bad, right? He's basically saying, I have all these bad feelings inside me. I don't know how to kind of deal with them. And of course, even though the Peter Boyle character is well-meaning, he's not a psychologist. He can't really help him, right? He can just kind of give him these kind of...
Go get laid, he says.
And he goes, and even Travis goes, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Even he knows it's not really good advice. But yet he, that's, the only person he has to talk to. And then there's the the great scene with Scorsese himself, where Scorsese plays this a guy who maybe is a psychopath. This guy who gets into the back of his car and describes in graphic detail how he's going to kill his wife, who's cheating on him, with an African American, not unimportant to the overall thematics of the film. And in that scene, Scorsese talks about this scene and how De Niro, basically made him and this is one of the things De Niro does so well working with other actors is that he wouldn't actually, because the Scorsese character he plays is supposed to tell him to stop the meter. And De Niro says, "I'm not going to actually stop the meter until you convince me that I should." Right? As I'm not just going to do it just because you say it. You have to convince me to the point where this character would do that. And that whole scene is, I think, a really brilliant one. It's because Travis is constantly looking at the mirror, and he's almost looking at this. It's almost like a manifestation of Travis's worst kind of desires or worst impulses that he's literally kind of shown up in his mirror, in his backseat mirror. And so, the film is kind of filled with those kind of scenes and those kind of, and this great performance by De Niro and all of these particular kind of moments that you remember over and over watching the film.
It's important to also note that Travis is likely a Viet vet, and he's got this sort of little boy lost kind of look throughout the film. And you mentioned him looking back at the Scorsese character, and Scorsese has two appearances in the film. One, he's just a guy sitting outside the campaign headquarters, and then he's this nut job. But one of the things I do want to, before we move on to New York, and we'll go through that rather quickly because I don't think there's much to say there, but one of the things that in later years that I think has come along is this idea that the end of Taxi Driver is a dream. And it reminds me of this nonsense I read about the end of the great Western film Shane, where some people have said Shane ends up dying, even though there's absolutely no evidence on screen. Do you have any truck with the people who think that the ending where Travis becomes a hero and gets the letter from the little girl's family, and then he sees the Sybil Shepherd character again is a dream and that Travis has died? I don't see any evidence of that. I think it works perfectly as realism. This is the early part of the media where, you're going to get, he's the hero who saves the little girl from the bad mobster pimps and whatnot. Do either of you have any truck with the idea that the ending is a dream? Because I think Scorsese has dismissed it.
I heard that and I thought, wow, that never occurred to me. I mean, I've seen the movie, I don't know how many times. When I've heard that, I thought, okay, well, I can see that, and certainly it's an interesting interpretation, but I don't buy it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that was what was in Paul Schrader's mind when he wrote the film. And I've talked to Paul Schrader about this, and he basically, this Travis Bickle character is an extrapolation of where Paul Schrader was in his life at that time, just in terms of the turmoil in his brain. And I think at that point he had already started using cocaine, and which was exacerbating his sense of loneliness and isolation living in LA, trying to be a critic and a screenwriter. So I don't think that it holds up as an actual theory, and certainly if Scorsese has disavowed it, I think that's the ultimate source right there.
Mark, any truck with you?
Yeah. I don't particularly like the interpretation, even though I would reject. I think just because Scorsese and Schrader say it's not, I think you can read. I'm not one for the intentional fallacy. I mean, I'm not one for if the author says whatever the author says it means, that's what it means. I think there's audiences can kind of. Right. I think as long as there's some evidence in the text that it's, and I actually think it's not totally outrageous. I mean, I think the reading came about because people felt that the ending was unrealistic. The idea that this guy would, they had just seen an attempt to, or like to see at least the Secret Service people thought he was about to assassinate this Palatine character, that they would then, the same night he goes and massacres these people, and then they say, oh yeah, no problem, he gets off. The people, I think, had a problem with that. But I think, actually, why I reject the dream ending is I think if you take that ending, the film is less of a critique of, less a social critique. And I think that's part of what Scorsese. I think what part of the meaning of the film is that. And again, you mentioned that Bernard gets the fact that he did get off for doing something kind of similar. I think what Scorsese, what the film gets at is that, um, yeah, I think the irony of the ending doesn't come true, right? The irony of the ending is this guy, if he had been successful as a political assassin, would have been demonized, and because he kills the right people, quote unquote, he's a hero, right? And I think you have to have that meaning's very crucial to the film, and turning into a dream makes it too much like this subjective. I think it goes too far into Travis as a character and kind of fixates too much on him and doesn't actually open up the kind of social meaning of the film, which I always when I view films I'm more interested in.
Yeah, and Travis, I don't think has the ideational capacity to even think like that. You could argue Rupert Pupkin, and some people have argued the ending of a film we'll talk about in a little bit, The King of Comedy. Also, people have claimed that that's a fantasy. Rupert, I think, is more capable of that, and we'll talk about that later. But I don't think Travis was. As I mentioned, then the next film is New York, New York, and while it's not a bad film, I don't think it's just what it is. It's I guess one of those films he had to get out of his system at growing up watching musicals. Is there really anything to say about that from either of you?
Well, I mean, it gave us the song "New York, New York," and really, I would say that the first half of that film is pretty enjoyable. It's really Scorsese going after the idea of a musical, and it's this whole long opening sequence that technically is pretty amazing in terms of the camera movements and the way it incorporates the music and these characters. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, it's a film that doesn't work mostly because of, I think, of the script and because he made several stylistic choices in terms of how much like a sound stage he wanted things to look, to the point where it's obviously a sound stage. And I think most people weren't ready for that. Plus, again, a downbeat ending, and people didn't want that in a musical. I mean, people didn't want musicals anyways. Musicals were pretty much over. Although New York, New York came out, and then, within a couple of months, you had Saturday Night Fever, which was a whole different kind of musical, where they weren't actually performing the music, but the music was pretty crucial to the film. So it's certainly a curiosity, and as you said, I don't think he's ever made a bad film. I think he's made several that were ill-advised, but I don't think he's made a bad film. The guy, every movie he's made, it's like you can see in every frame of every film his excitement about making those movies.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I'll defend the film a bit more. I think it's actually a very good film, but it is a difficult film, I think, in terms of, I think it's basically, it's the closest to like an Altman type of film that Scorsese's ever made. Altman was all about these genre deconstructions, right, where he would take a popular genre and then basically kind of critique it. And I think this is Scorsese's kind of genre deconstruction of the musical, where he takes the musical and inserts the Robert De Niro performance style in particular. And I think that what's really interesting, the clash of De Niro and Liza Minnelli is very much not only a clash in their characters' personalities and within the plot, but even of different types of performers and different types of performance styles. And I really like that aspect of the film as well. And yeah, like I think there's a lot of great things in the movie, but it is I think a kind of a painful film to watch, actually. It just in terms of like it's. I mean, again, I don't mean that that it's a bad film, but it's a film that, if you're looking for an enjoyable musical, it's not that. It's a film that's trying to actually, get at something different and actually critique the kind of happy endings of the and it has that whole happy ending sequence towards the end, which is a really great sequence I really like a lot. So yeah, I think there's a lot of really good things in the movie. I think the film works for what it's trying to do, but yeah, it was a commercial disaster as well, which probably didn't help, and critically not very well received. But it has been a movie that's been kind of reevaluated. There are a lot of critics actually, right in the '80s, especially critics ideological critics who were looking at kind of 70s movies and saw a lot of interesting things in the movie as kind of this critique of the Hollywood ideology. But yeah, it was certainly not a successful film, and a film that really kind of hurt Scorsese's career. It famously opened right around the same time as Star Wars, and everyone actually thought New York was going to be the big hit, and Star Wars was going to be the bomb, and of course the exact opposite happened to the extreme.
Well, let's end this segment here because we've gotten through the 70s, and when we get back, I want to start with Raging Bull in the 1980s, and we'll do that in a moment. Speaking of the career of Martin Scorsese with Mark Raymond and Marshall Fine, we left off right before Raging Bull, and as I had mentioned, this is sort of one of the two of the three films, along with Taxi Driver and Goodfellas, that people, critics, and fans always point to as one of the the greatest of the Scorsese films. And this is probably the one that film critics certainly have called like the greatest film of the 80s, even though it came out just in 1980. And this got De Niro, I believe, his second Oscar win as Jake LaMotta. It's filmed in black and white, which by that time showed the power Scorsese had acquired to be able to do a black and white film, a major film like that. Let me start with you, Marshall. Does it deserve all the praise that it's gotten?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is a landmark film. It's just an amazing film to watch. I mean, not just historically, but I mean, it still feels incredibly contemporary because of the cinematography, because of the performances, and the fact that this guy isn't a hero. I mean, Jake LaMotta is basically a goon with a talent, an inarticulate goon, and the most fascinatingly inarticulate character to ever build a movie, almost 3 hour movie around. The fact that, I mean, the stunt aspect of De Niro's performance, the fact that he gained all of this weight for the bookend end and beginning of the movie, showing Jake in his later years after he's ballooned up, certainly got a lot of attention at the time. But it's still, the performance itself is so visceral, so in the moment. I mean, it may be to me De Niro's best performance because the anguish, the sheer physicality of this character, the fact that he can't express his feelings, that his feelings are so primal, and that the boxing ring is his outlet, and that when he's not in the boxing ring, the guy is basically lost in his life, doesn't really know how to be a human being. And doesn't know how to deal with other people, basically lives through his fists, through his impulse towards violence, and that's ultimately what saves him and what condemns him, what curses him. It's such a fascinating character study. Again, so much of the time it was a downbeat period. It's the end of the 1970s. Ronald Reagan was just about to be elected president, and here's this monumental film about one man carving out his place in the world, despite the fact that he really has no sense of vision or anything else beyond the end of his fists. The cinematography, the action, the boxing itself is so brutal, so in the moment. It's maybe the greatest boxing movie ever made, and it's certainly, as you said, one of the great, if not the greatest film of the 80s.
Yeah, it's an amazingly kind of a shot and edited film. It won an Oscar also for Thelma Schoonmaker, I believe, for that year for best editing, and really deserved. It's one of the, and also the cinematography by Michael Chapman. The last time Scorsese and Chapman worked together, Chapman also shot Taxi Driver, and yeah, you can see the craft, and I should also mention, of course, that the sound design of the film is also astounding as well. And so all of those kind of, and I mentioned, this is kind of why the film is so loved by filmmakers, because the craft of the movie is so amazing. And you have, of course, De Niro giving us another great performance in the center. Even though I think I prefer his performance in Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy, just because this character is so kind of I guess primal is the word people use, or things like that. That yeah, there isn't as much kind of for De Niro to do because it's a very physical performance, but mentally this guy is just kind of uh, can't deal with his emotions. He doesn't know how to express himself other than simply rage and simply to act out in a violent way. And this is also like New York, New York, a very painful film, I think, to watch, despite everything that's so technically brilliant about it. There are scenes that are of him abusing his wife and then eventually even beating up his brother in front of his brother's family that are really hard to watch, and in his own kind of self-destruction as well towards the end of the movie. And even though it ends with this kind of slightly redemptive kind of note, it's still quite downbeat. And actually, um, the film ends with this kind of biblical quote and then sort of a dedication to Scorsese's NYU film teacher, Harry Manoogian. And the ending of it almost feels like Scorsese's own redemption as well. There's famously, Scorsese had almost died from kind of his drug addiction in the late 70s. And De Niro, this is actually a movie De Niro really wanted to do for many years, and finally was able to basically went to Scorsese apparently in the hospital and said, let's do this movie. Let's kind of, it sort of gave Scorsese something to sort of work towards. And yeah, the result is this kind of this great movie, like what many people call it, even though many people call it the greatest movie of the 1980s, but also many people call it, the last great movie of the 1970s, even though it came out in 1980, just in a sense of, it's kind of at the end period of this, great period of American cinema that would soon be kind of finished.
Yeah, ironically, LaMotta is still alive. I think he's like 95 or 96 now. I do want to talk about Joe Pesci's performance because he was a B film actor. I think he did some commercials and whatnot, and this put him on the map. And it's the first of his sort of like nasty, angry, violent little Dago roles. He sort of did the same character in Goodfellas and then later in Casino. But I think this is his most believable role because he's got vulnerability here. And you mentioned when LaMotta De Niro beats the crap out of him, it's believable. Where by Casino, where De Niro is sort of cowering in front of this little 5'4" man, it's kind of almost a meta parody. What do you think about Pesci's role as the brother?
Well, I think that certainly it was the role that made him as an actor, and yet you go from Raging Bull in 1980 to Goodfellas in 1990. I dare you to name three great Joe Pesci performances in between.
Yeah.
He was an actor who was made for Scorsese because he's got that sort of explosive quality. Whereas De Niro has an explosive quality, but he's got a real interior quality. He's much more interior. Whereas Pesci is like he's spraying it all the time. His energy, his stuff. This was maybe his most controlled of those performances, just because he was not someone who had power. He was someone who was next to someone who had power, who was trying to control that guy to try and keep him on a leash, and that gave him that vulnerability and that sort of humanity that he doesn't really have too much in Goodfellas, and particularly not in Casino. So I think that Joe Pesci is not a limited actor, but he's an actor who's got a certain range, and Scorsese really tapped into that.
Yeah, there's really only one kind of moment in the film where you see what you eventually get with Goodfellas and Casino, the moment where he beats up the guy played by Frank Vincent, who would eventually kind of kill him at the end of Casino, and who also plays the character who Pesci's character kills in Goodfellas. And there's a moment where he's beating him up, and I think he's slamming a car door repeatedly. But that's kind of one of the few, even though Pesci still has his energy, where he's constantly, very animated. You don't get he clearly isn't the kind of crazy kind of loose cannon that he is in the later movies. He's more of trying to be somebody who tries to control his brother, and who obviously feels the closest to his brother. And one of my favorite Pesci actually scenes is the last scene between the two brothers in this film, where
Yeah.
LaMotta sees him, tries to kind of reconcile, and I think Pesci plays that scene very well, very kind of more underplayed, and you get a sense of this guy who's just kind of doesn't really want anything to do with his brother, but also still feels this kind of empathy for him despite everything.
Yeah, and then the next film is The King of Comedy, and to me, this is sort of the equivalent to Woody Allen's Stardust Memory, in that it was a film that was lambasted when it came on, but if you look now, it's become. I think Stardust Memories is Woody Allen's greatest film, and I think The King of Comedy is one of the 2 or 3 greatest Scorsese films, and even like on something as low as common denominator as Rotten Tomatoes, it's got over a 90% favorable rating. Whereas when it came out, it was almost, I mean, if you could find 2 or 3 critics that said anything positive about it, you'd be lucky. What? Let's talk about we mentioned Rupert Pupkin and whatnot. I think Pupkin is, in a sense, a more dangerous character than Travis Bickle in many ways, because he's smarter than Bickle. Marshall, what is your take on The King of Comedy?
So it's 1983, 1984. We're in the middle of the Reagan administration, and Scorsese, the last movie he made was Raging Bull, and now here he comes with a film that has the word comedy in the title, and yet isn't an obvious comedy. It has a lot of funny things in it. The great performances, and the brilliant idea of using Jerry Lewis to play this Johnny Carson-like character, the discovery of Sandra Bernhard to play Rupert's sidekick.
Yeah, Masha.
And this movie was reviled when it came out. People say, "Oh, this is what happened to Martin Scorsese? This is a movie. It's not funny. It's just too dark. It's just too downbeat." And yet the movie, again, like Network or Taxi Driver, this film was prescient in terms of forecasting this idea of everybody wanting to be a star, everybody having that access to, if you can just get on TV, your life will change, and that's certainly Rupert Pupkin's driving thing. He feels like he should be as big a comedy star as the Jerry Raymond character, the one that Jerry Lewis plays, and he just hasn't had his break. If he can just get on this show, his life will change. The world will recognize his genius, and that was anathema to people at that point in the morning in America. Ronald Reagan, everything's great. We shouldn't have to have these kind of self-doubts and sense that that celebrity is empty and that's celebrity is a great thing. Why are you making fun of it? So I think this film is brilliant. I think it's as you said, I think it's one of his best. It's one of my favorites of his, and it really, you watch it now and it's like, wow, this is like a time machine forecasting what was going to happen in 20 years.
Yeah, I agree. This has always been a film I've really sort of admired. And yeah, it was not very well received at the time. And also was just kind of the movie that was a real crisis point in Scorsese's career, in the sense that it really bombed. I think the movie cost like $22 million and made like 2, which is not good, obviously. So it was probably the biggest, probably even more of a disaster even than New York. And so, and it actually made Scorsese go back, as we'll talk about, to New York and make After Hours, this kind of indie, like low-budget indie film, and then eventually kind of make The Color of Money to try to get himself back into kind of Hollywood's good graces. And The King of Comedy, I've actually, I write about it a bit in my book. It's based on an article I wrote, and I kind of call the article "Too Smart, Too Soon." And I think, because I think the film really kind of predicted this kind of rise of what one critic has called the American smart cinema of the indie films of the 1990s. I think it really fits in much more with those type of movies, like directors like Todd Solondz and people like that. I think it kind of predicted this really black comedy that was this kind of dark satire on American culture. I think people just weren't ready for that kind of movie at the time in the early 1980s. But since then, in the 90s and into the 2000s, it's a movie that's getting kind of reevaluated and seen as this important work in Scorsese's career, even if it hasn't quite reached the level of Taxi Driver or Raging Bull or Goodfellas.
Well, you watch TV now, or even movies, and many there's a whole genre of comedy that makes people squirm, that makes you laugh uncomfortably, which is what this movie did. Movies didn't do that at that point. Making people squirm was not a goal that most filmmakers or writers had. Now it's a very common thing, whether it's Larry David or even going back to Gary Shandling and the Larry Sanders Show. Yeah, the squirm comedy is a thing unto itself now. This, I would say, called sort of the progenitor of contemporary squirm comedy.
Yeah, for sure. It's there's even a reference in the Larry Sanders Show to Rupert Pupkins. They actually make a little joke in one of the early episodes, and it's definitely The Office, the comedy of Ricky Gervais, Larry David, all of this stuff. It's again. The game of comedy would have fit very well into that era in the late '90s into 2000, but it was not a type of comedy that was popular at the time, and because the main emotion of this movie is embarrassment, actually, right? And it's almost like he takes you mentioned that moment in Taxi Driver where the camera moves away from Travis on the phone with Betsy as he's being rejected. It's almost like too painful for us to watch, which is interesting because we see the violence at the end in graphic detail, with fingers being blown off and blood spurting everywhere. And I think Scorsese realized that violence is much more acceptable than embarrassment. Embarrassment we don't want to watch, because embarrassment comes through to us. Like, we start to feel embarrassed, whereas if you see somebody get killed, you don't really feel physical pain. And so it's a very different emotion, and one that, with King of Comedy, he decides, I'm going to make a whole movie about this emotion. And it just, audiences and critics kind of rejected it.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole sequence, all those sequences in his basement where he set up the fake set for the talk show, and he's got the cutouts of these people. It's like, that's a whole industry now. This is, no offense, Dan, but this is, in a large part what a lot of podcasts amount to. Yeah. That, everybody feels like they can be a star. Now, I have to step away just for a second to let my dog out of my office because he needs to go outside. So okay. I'll be right back.
As Marshall goes away, the next film that we can talk about and that I want to bring up is After Hours. We talk about a black comedy, and After Hours, we just talked about After Hours, Marshall. After Hours feels to me like a great Second City television skit, brought out large. The guy, Griffin Dunn, plays a character who's in an anachronistic job. He's even called a word processor. And he goes on sort of this New York version of Leopold Bloom's journey through Dublin. It's sort of like an odd, dark Joycean trip through New York of the 1980s, and I think it's the great lost film of Scorsese's. No one ever talks about it as one of his great films, but I think it's certainly a great comedy. Marshall or Mark, either of you, what are your thoughts about that film?
It's always been one of my favorites. That and King of Comedy. Scorsese doesn't make comedies very often, but these two are really right on. And again, they're because of that sense of discomfort that he creates in the things that you're laughing at. Here's this guy who meets a girl. She lives down in Soho, which at this point in history was still this kind of uncharted territory in New York City. That it was just sort of blooming as this downtown art scene. People were renting lofts and moving south of Houston Street in New York City, and it was like this scene that was just starting to come, but it was still sort of mysterious and otherworldly. And so, you mentioned Leopold Bloom. I would sort of call it almost a descent into hell, because this guy goes chasing this girl, loses his money before he even gets out of the taxi, and winds up on this weird trip where he's bouncing from person to person with this great cast that includes, everybody from Linda Fiorentino to Cheech and Chong. And I think it's a fascinating film. Like you said, a lost film. Again, a time capsule of a period that you don't usually get in films. I think it's a funny movie. I think people ought to rediscover it. I've talked to Griffin Dunn about it because he produced it, and it's one of his favorites too. So if you have never seen After Hours, you absolutely should track it down and watch.
Yeah, it's I like the film. It's I'm not as enthusiastic about it as probably the two of you. I wonder it might have something. I think it might be Scorsese's most New York film, maybe in a way. And maybe I've been to New York, but I've never lived there. I've only been there a couple times for a few days at a time. And so I'm wondering if maybe it was. It's a film that, because I know a lot of people who do love the film, and also it's a movie. Even though it's this kind of comedy and it's even though a very dark one, it's got a lot of very strange and esoteric kind of references in it, like to the art world and things like these, and these kind of little in jokes and things like that. And so I know a friend of mine who's like he's more involved in the art world and in museums and things like that, who really kind of loves it and kind of really gets all of the kind of comedy and the jokes in the movie. And yeah, so maybe it's one that's it's never really kind of connected to me, even though I do enjoy the film and I think there's lots of great things in it. And I really like he's working for the first time with Michael Ballhaus, the great cinematographer. And there's a lot of and the movie was made kind of it's really kind of an independent movie. It actually, I believe, won. Scorsese won Best Director at the first Independent Spirit Awards for this movie. It's kind of like he kind of going back to, I think, shared the award with Joel Cohen for Blood Simple, their first movie. So yeah, it's just kind of more of an independent film that's having to do kind of innovative things on a lower budget, and that's kind of why he wanted to work with Michael Ballhaus, because Ballhaus was used to working with Rainer Werner Fassbinder in Germany, used to working quickly. Apparently, that's one of the reasons why he and Chapman stopped working together. Was just Scorsese found Chapman too slow. As brilliant as his work was, he wanted somebody who was who worked faster, who could do more setups, and who was comfortable moving the camera. And yeah, After Hours has a lot of kind of great kind of shots in it as well, with these two artists kind of collaborating for the first time.
Now, as underrated as After Hours is, The Color of Money to me strikes me as just a paycheck for Scorsese. It seems a rather pointless remake. It's not a bad film by any stretch of the imagination, but it strikes me as a lot of 21st century Scorsese films do. A movie that is a Hollywood movie to its core, but there's no essential Scorsese, and he's just going through the motions. To me, it's his worst film of the 80s, although it's not, again, a bad film. What is your take on that film?
I don't think it's his worst film. Well, I don't know if it's worst film of the '80s because I try to look at the totality.
I didn't say of the '80s. His worst film of the '80s.
His worst film of the '80s. No, I understand. I don't think it's a bad film. I think it's a very competent film. I think it's doing exactly what he needed it to do, which was give him the kind of commercial credibility that he had lost, because as critically acclaimed as Raging Bull was, I don't think it was a huge commercial success. And then he makes After Hours and King of Comedy, neither of which do huge business. And he needs something to bring himself back so that he can make the bigger movies that he has in his mind, like Goodfellas. And so I guess I would argue that without The Color of Money, we wouldn't have Goodfellas. That The Color of Money gave him credibility, and right or wrong, it finally got Paul Newman. Did it get his Oscar for that one? Yeah. So he got his Oscar. After many years of deserving one. And just the idea of teaming Tom Cruise with Paul Newman, two huge icons of different generations, I thought was pretty brilliant. And there's some amazing shots in this film. I mean, just the way he shot the pool sequences is so kinetic and so dynamic that I can't dismiss the film. I mean, it's a solid piece of filmmaking craftsmanship. It's not necessarily artistry.
Yeah, I mean, again, he's working with Ballhaus again, and it's a lot of those pool sequences are quite great. Just the problem is, the story is just not that interesting ultimately, and it just doesn't really. And as good as Newman is, and as good as Cruise is, I like both of the performances. Yeah, there isn't. I think it is one of his. If I was ranking Scorsese's feature films, it would be pretty low on my list of his movies. There's a couple others from the 2000s I'm not that fond of, but it'd be around in the bottom five for sure.
Now, Last Temptation of Christ, of course, had a lot of the controversy. Nothing compared to Mel Gibson's film 20 years later. But, of course, when you're dealing with Christ, it's based on the Kazantzakis book. Scorsese's often said this was the film he wanted to do the most of any throughout his career, I believe, at least up to that point. And yet, when I watch it again, it's one of those films that, it's interesting. There's some good performances. There's some good moments. But, Harvey Keitel with a Brooklyn accent as, I think it's Judas, I'm going to fuck you up the ass, Christ, that kind of attitude. It's like, there's something just not, it doesn't click on all cylinders. What is your take on that film?
Well, I mean, I would argue that, in fact, this movie was much more controversial than Passion of the Christ. Passion of the Christ was controversial because it was so violent. This movie was condemned by the churches because it was considered heretical. It was considered blasphemous, which is a whole different thing. I mean, there were boycotts. There were attempts to keep this movie from being shown. And so I think that, and the fact that they actually got it, I mean, and in fact, production broke down. They lost the money at one point out of fear of that kind of controversy, and eventually did get it made. Because De Niro, for a long time, was supposed to play Christ, and eventually he aged out, and he went with Willem Dafoe instead. I think it's a better movie than you do, Dan, just because yes, there are the anachronisms of Harvey Keitel's accent and things like that, and yet there's always been this spiritual element to Scorsese's work. As I said, he did consider the seminary at one point, and I feel like it's as spiritual a work as he's ever done. That it's questioning, that it's striving to understand, and that it's again offering us an alternative view of what might have been. It's based on the novel, and ultimately the controversy was about the sort of fantasy sequence that happens at the end as Christ is on the cross, imagining what would happen if he got down and lived a normal life, and then we go back to him on the cross dying. And yet there are these people who condemn the film, saying, "Oh, this is a movie about Jesus having sex," which of course it was not. And that's like saying the movie 127 Hours is a movie about a guy cutting off his arm. It's one aspect of the movie, but that's not what the movie is about. And neither is Last Temptation of Christ. I think it's a better movie than that. It's obviously it's a little slower film, and certainly if you're not into the subject matter, being a Martin Scorsese fan is the one thing that'll keep you watching all the way through.
Yeah, it's not a favorite of mine, but I do kind of admire it. And certainly it had, like you mentioned, Scorsese tried to make this film for many years. They actually started. Aidan Quinn was actually originally cast back in '83. They came very close to getting the film off the ground, and then just it kind of fell apart. And then finally, after making The Color of Money, he's able to get it. I mean, the film was made on a pretty low budget. It was made. They weren't able to get a lot of money for it, but enough to sort of get the film made, and kind of withstand the protest and the attempt to kind of boycott the film. And even after the film came out, for example, I believe Blockbuster Video wouldn't carry the film for many years back at the time. It was a very, very controversial film. And what I find quite interesting is I think the people who admire this film the most are Christians. Actually, I think the film works much better for Christians, but for certain types of Christian, obviously not a fundamentalist Christianity that rejects any kind of Christ human kind of nature, but people who are Christians but who consider doubt a big part of Christian faith as kind of the flip side of Christian faith really love this movie. It's often talked about most glowingly by people. And as somebody who's not a Christian myself, I think that's the disconnect for me. I don't quite connect with it emotionally, maybe for that reason. But it's a film, yeah, I do admire, and even the stuff with Keitel and the kind of accents. I found that actually kind of an interesting take, because he was trying to actually, I think, depict the apostles as this kind of almost like a New York street gang kind of thing, and it kind of connects back to Scorsese's, his earlier work with Mean Streets, the idea of uh, the quote of the Bruce Springsteen song, it's hard to be a saint in the city, that kind of thing, where, you have these characters who are deeply Christian, like Charlie and Mean Streets, who are trying to do good, but, feel like, oh, we have to do it on the streets. And I think Last Temptation of Christ is taking up on that idea. It may not work quite perfectly, but it's, I think it's an admirable film.
Now, 89 saw him do one of these throwback films to like the 1960s, where you had European directors doing little mini films together throughout the 60s. He did New York Stories with Woody Allen and Coppola, and his little 35, 40-minute film, Life Lessons, is generally considered, and I would agree, the best of the three little short films in there. It's basically a tale of an artist who is rejected by his lover. She goes away, and he goes through the process where he gets a new lover and a new person to tutor. What do you think of that little film there? Because to me, that's one of the few short films and one of the few films in those types of films, and I've seen a lot of the European versions, where I would have think that could have been expanded into a full film and been interesting.
Oh, it absolutely deals with the sort of the themes of obsessiveness that characterize a lot of his films, and certainly that, particularly the obsessiveness of a lover, as well as the relationship between those feelings and creativity. And plus, he was smart enough to cast Nick Nolte, pre sort of caricature, as this artist, and he also has Steve Buscemi as sort of one of the first performance artists sort of depicted in movies before performance art became sort of this punchline. And so, again, I agree with you. I think it could have been an interesting full film.
And Arquette, Patricia Arquette, one second, Bob. Patricia Arquette, I think, is at her absolute best here in sort of the pre-Lily Taylor, queen of the indie kind of films here. She did these roles throughout the 80s with Sales, and we mentioned After Hours, and here, before Lily Taylor took that mantle from her, this is her just at, I think, her finest there. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think it's...
Or Rosanna Arquette. I said Patricia. It's Rosanna, sorry.
Arquette, yeah.
There's so many damn Arquettes.
I think it's a very, very good film. It's I kind of like these kind of these omnibus films. I found them actually kind of interesting, and this one is the Coppola film is actually quite bad, but the Allen film's kind of interesting.
It's like cute, funny
Jewish mother joke.
Yeah.
But this is I think the best of the three, and it's another film where Scorsese is exploring kind of like After Hours as well, this kind of the art world in a way, but this time instead of taking the outsider perspective, where After Hours, the Griffin Dunn character, isn't part of this world and is kind of trapped in it. In this film, we get Nick Nolte, the artist character, as the kind of the main character, and I really love the opening of this film. I really like where you have him painting and you have this music on the soundtrack, and the song is escaping one later shade of pale, I believe.
Yeah.
It's kind of playing over the soundtrack. Yeah, it's one of the great kind of little 2 or 3 minute kind of depictions of an artist and how an artist kind of works. I think that's sort of captured on film. I quite like the film, and I think it probably could have been maybe expanded into feature length, but I like as it is. I think it works quite well as this kind of 40-minute short film, which unfortunately, like a lot of filmmakers, can't really make anymore, right? Like you have to make a feature, right? It's really hard to make a short film and kind of get a short film kind of distributed once you become a major kind of director. And yeah, and I also would. Sorry, go ahead.
For any filmmaker to get a short film out.
Yeah, and Scorsese made a lot of really great short films back in the '60s that I would encourage people to check out. The Big Shave, which is a really great little 5-minute short. It's Not Just You, Murray, which is a movie he made while a student at NYU, a film he actually made before Who's That Knocking at My Door. So yeah, I really like the fact that he was able to get this, able to work in this kind of shorter kind of format with this film. I think it works quite well.
Now, I want to talk about Goodfellas, and when we get to the post-Goodfellas films, I want to just talk more overall themes, because to me, just as Mean Streets is sort of the heading up into the Himalayas of his most fertile period, Goodfellas is the last K2 or Mount Everest of his films, and everything after that, to me, is him sort of copying himself. I've talked about with other people about Woody Allen having his golden period from 77 to 92. And to me, Goodfellas seems the last original, the last fully Scorsese great film that's inarguably a great film, whereas everything else is him just taking little snatches, sort of stealing back from himself. Goodfellas comes out 1990s, and this is probably, at least in the public's eye, the film. We've talked about critics, preferring Taxi Driver, but to me, this is where people think of Scorsese, and it's big in, say, the hip hop. It's influenced hip hop the way King of New York later around the same time did. You have the Joe Pesci at his most manic. You have the MTV editing, as they call it, during the time, the mixture of the music. I mean, just technically speaking, it's one of the most brilliant films ever made. And it's not only technically brilliant, but it's also Scorsese at his full powers there. I think both of us, or most of us, have said we think Taxi Driver is his best film, but Goodfellas is certainly, just a hair behind.
Well, it's really hard to separate Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Goodfellas. Those are Scorsese at his peak, but I think I would argue that Goodfellas is Scorsese at his with the ultimate control of his powers. Really, the vision and the wherewithal to carry it out, and the cast. Like you said, it is the last. I think it is the last great Scorsese film. I'm a big fan of The Departed and Hugo, even. But yeah, I feel like he's sort of not parodied himself, but copied himself subsequently. I mean, to me, Casino is sort of Goodfellas light, taken too much length. Goodfellas just exploded off the screen with energy, with originality, with a look at the mafia that demythified it in a way that The Godfather mythified it. It was sort of almost the anti-Godfather, coming almost 20 years after The Godfather. And it's a movie that still, you watch it now, and it just explodes. I mean, the energy in that movie, and again, that sense of excitement in every single frame of the film that he's making. I think that it's Scorsese and Spielberg are the only two directors whose films, no matter how good or bad, always have that sense of excitement and just making the movie and getting it on the screen and getting it out of his head and onto the celluloid or digital as it has become. And to me, it's a movie I can watch over and over again. The performances, De Niro is, you look at the posters, De Niro is the star, but really it's Ray Liotta and Joe Pesci are the stars of this film. I think it made Ray Liotta's career. Joe Pesci won the Oscar for this film. Scorsese should have won the Oscar, but just as Raging Bull lost to Ordinary People, Taxi Driver lost to Rocky, and Goodfellas loses to Dances with Wolves. Now, which of these movies are people still talking about? Obviously, the Scorsese. I mean, I will say, I am a fan of Ordinary People. I'm even a fan of Dances with Wolves, but neither of them are as good as the two films that they beat. And it is. I think you're right. This may be number one on my Scorsese list, but it goes back. It depends on which day you ask me.
Yeah, it's a great film, obviously, and it's yeah, technically brilliant film. And there's shots in the movie that you kind of just the obvious example, the Copacabana sequence is just one of the many examples you could pick out of these. You know, it's a film actually. As a film teacher, I use a lot to talk about certain techniques. There's this great shot near the end of the film um, where Leota's character is meeting De Niro in the and he's not sure if De Niro's going to kill him at this kind of cafe, and you get this great scene where the background is kind of collapsing in on the characters, and he's basically the camera's moving back as it's zooming in, and it creates this really disorienting effect. Even though the first time you watch the film, you could perhaps even miss it, especially if you're. I remember when I first saw the film, I was quite young, and I don't remember consciously remembering the shot. Even though if you watch it now, it seems obvious what's happening. But it's meant to have this subtle psychological effect on the viewer to make you feel the unease of the character. Yeah. And the film has so many sort of examples of that. And it's also very much a film about storytelling too, which I really enjoy about it. The fact that you're getting the constant narration of the Ray Liotta character, and even eventually the Lorraine Bracco character who plays his wife, who's also great in the film. And so yeah, there's a lot in the film, even though my view of Scorsese's '90s films is much more favorable, I think, than yours, at least, Dan. I think the collapse comes after, for me, begins with Gangs of New York, actually. I think I like his '90s films quite a bit, maybe because this is when I've seen Scorsese films in the theater for the first time. And so I actually like Casino quite a bit. I don't think it's as good as, I don't put it as good as Goodfellas, but I think it's a very different film than Goodfellas in a way, even though superficially it seems very similar. I think Goodfellas is straight up a black comedy and a kind of critique of, consumerism and basically the whole Reagan kind of era. I think that's what's kind of underneath that film. Casino has a much more, I think, tragic kind of tone to it. And I could understand it not working for everybody, but I really think that's a great film, and I like The Age of Innocence quite a bit as well, his adaptation of that novel. Even something like Cape Fear, even though it's this kind of remake, there's a lot of kind of interesting things in it, and I like the way he reworks that story. So yeah, I like the '90s films in general much more. But yeah, this is the great Scorsese movie of the '90s.
Well,
just like Taxi Driver is in the '70s and Raging Bull is of the '80s.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I wanted to point out. I earlier had said that films like Ghost Dog or Mean Streets or The Killing of a Chinese Bookie were more realistic gangster portrayals. And I stick by that. And one of the things that's interesting is the film was based on Nicholas Pileggi's book. And Pileggi, is a noted crime writer, and Henry Hill. Famously, when The Godfather was being made, that film was influenced by a lot of the New York gangsters who started adopting a lot of the mannerisms and the mythos that portrayed in that film as if it had occurred beforehand. And a similar thing happens here in the Goodfellas, in that a lot of the stories that you hear about some of the most famous scenes were told by Pileggi or Hill are clearly apocryphal and go back to mafia legends like Al Capone. Supposedly it's told that Pesci did the "what me funny" thing. That's something he heard, but that goes back to the 1930s. The scene where they go and beat up the guy in Florida for money that he owes for some reason or whatnot, that's another mafia legend that goes back to Frank Nitti. And famously, the spider scene where Pesci blows up and shoots the kid is another mafia legend that goes back 30 or 40 years. And it's interesting because all of those stories are stuff that Scorsese believed in. And because he believed that these were real things that happened to Henry Hill, which was just him bullshitting Scorsese, Scorsese gives them a reality in the moment in the film that a lesser filmmaker wouldn't have. And I've always just found it interesting because people often talk about art as truth. Goodfellas is the ultimate lie, in a sense, even more so than The Godfather, about the mafia, because it makes them these sexy MTV era kind of hip-hop icons. And yet 90% of the stories in there are just total bullshit. And I don't know if you guys, you probably didn't grow up in the kind of area I did, so I knew a lot of this going in when I watched the film the first time in the theater. But it shows you, I think, why this is such a great film is that Scorsese has such a belief in the bullshit that Henry Hill is feeding him that he makes it real. Just any comment about that in regard to that film, because I think that's one of the things missing in the later Scorsese films is there's a lack of realism. There's a lack of the belief of the filmmaker in the material he's handling.
I would disagree with you just in the sense that as glamorous as Goodfellas tries to make it, I think that I would hope that the average person seeing this, or at least as I watched this film, this was a young man worshiping people who, to the viewer watching the film, are obviously lowlifes. That he's joined in this world that has this false sense of values, and buys into it and ultimately is destroyed by it. I think that, and in terms of whether the stories are true or not, it's a movie. The average person seeing this movie for the first time when it came out doesn't have that background that you have or that historians would have, and so you're responding to the movie. It's to me the same argument as when any book is adapted. You've got the book and you've got the movie. Those are two different forms and have two different sets of requirements. And so what I take away from Goodfellas is just this. So the amazing economy of the visual storytelling. You've got a narrator and so much visual information when he's telling these stories. When he's recounting what happens to everybody that was involved in the Lufthansa heist, or talking about how they would bust out these people by taking over their businesses. He's telling the story, but you're seeing volume. Each of those shots that he strings together in those montages. So I guess it doesn't bother me in the way that it bothers you.
Yeah, and I think there's a point where the veracity of the stories, we can't really get at, but I think there's a sense in which the movie is kind of about how movie gangsters shape real gangsters, and they it becomes this kind of loop. So even though maybe these stories were true originally, maybe people reenacted the stories later in reality. We don't really know, right? And like for example, the scene where he kills Spider that you mentioned. What's Joe Pesci doing in that scene? He's saying, I'm Humphrey Bogart, I'm the Oklahoma Kid, and he starts shooting, he's referencing a movie, right? And there's constant movie references kind of in the film, and there's also this the thing about the film too that I think is I do think it glamorizes the gangsters, but I think it's doing it for a very specific reason, is saying that if you're like a working class kid like Henry Hill was, and there's a depiction of his home life, and he doesn't want to end up like his father, right? He doesn't want to end up.
And then he ends up like a schnook, as he says at the end. When he's in witness protection.
That's the radical thing about the ending, is that he isn't killed at the end. It's worse for him.
He's in purgatory.
He's in suburbia, and it's a great, the very ending of the film is this reference back to the great train robbery where Joe Pesci is firing. The long dead Joe Pesci character fires directly at the camera, and then we get a cut back to Henry Hill, and then on the soundtrack as he closes the door, we don't hear an ordinary door close. We hear a prison door slam, right? Because he is in prison, like he is kind of trapped in this place, and that's the kind of radical kind of edge I think of that film, is saying that if your options are this, that's why people become gangsters, right? Like that's because it is kind of something attractive compared to what, and I think the film tries to do that to the viewer, right? The whole Copacabana sequence is, Scorsese, Henry Hill seducing his girlfriend, and she is seduced into this lifestyle, right? Because of because she doesn't want to end up like her, Jewish middle class parents, right? She's kind of also, seduced by this kind of this lifestyle, right? and again, I think the critique of 80s consumerism is kind of right there in the film.
And I think the film is the last film of his, and the last film that I watched of Scorsese's was Up to the Departed. I haven't seen the last few because people have told me don't bother, but this is the last film where I think he's actually referencing his oldest influences, because there's a number of scenes in that film where the camera moves and you hear like the subliminal screech of a car or a train whistle, which goes back to E. Vitelloni and Fellini's film, which these characters, the three characters, have that E. Vitelloni kind of, these are Goombas hanging together kind of feel to it. Now, I'd mentioned the later films, and I don't want to do a 5-hour show, and so I want to talk about some of the major themes of the last quarter century. When I look at Cape Fear, I see De Niro does a good job, but I wonder why that film was made. The Age of Innocence is a very good film, but to me it's sort of lifeless. Casino is just sort of rerun of a well-made rerun of Goodfellas. Kundun has its moments. It's sort of like the Orientalist version of The Last Temptation of Christ to me. Then you get to me the whole, I guess you could call him the DiCaprio cycle. No, first off, you have Nicolas Cage. Speaking of Nick Nolte being parody, you have maybe Nicolas Cage right at the verge of becoming parodic himself. And then to me, I've never been a fan of DiCaprio. To me, he's always the little boy, and it's the underwear scene. I think it's in The Departed. Is like, he's sort of this parody of De Niro, and he's not convincing as a tough guy in Gangs of New York. He's woefully miscast in The Aviator, and in The Departed, I think that's the best of the three things that I've seen him with Scorsese. But so let's start from there. A lot of compare the DiCaprio Scorsese team to the De Niro Scorsese team. Is there really any comparison?
I'd say that, I think DiCaprio's a better actor than you do, but he's a very different actor than De Niro. He's much more expressive than De Niro is. I feel like a lot of those films, several of those films in the 90s were Scorsese sort of setting creative challenges for himself. I wonder if I can make an adaptation of Edith Wharton and make it work. Although I understand the attraction of that, because that is an entire movie basically about repression of emotion, and which has been a theme throughout his films. And I think that's really a lovely film, a really heartbreaking film with a great performance by Daniel Day-Lewis and a terrific performance by Winona Ryder, maybe one of her best ever, and whatever happened to her, and Michelle Pfeiffer. I think that of those films, that may be the best one. Bringing Out the Dead is sort of disposable to me. Kundun, again, I think it was him setting a creative challenge for himself to sort of see if he could use cinema to dive into a pretty esoteric subject. And visually, it's a stunning film. Dramatically, it really drags. But I feel like, I agree with you that when he gets to Gangs of New York and The Aviator, it's like Scorsese almost doing a parody of Scorsese. That here he's got all of these resources at his hand to make two big, basically historical epics. One about crime, one about Hollywood. Two subjects that fascinate him. And both movies, I think, tend to play to his worst instinct in terms of not being able to cut stuff. That they're both much longer than they need to be.
Yeah.
And yet I think they're probably better films than you give them credit for being.
Well, the thing with those films, especially in this century, the DiCaprio films that I've seen, is that my advice to Scorsese is limit yourself. Go back to smaller budget films. It encourages creativity. To me, he's gotten fat and sassy as a filmmaker. There isn't the kinetic energy on screen or behind the screen that I can tell. How about you, Mark?
Well, I think the kinetic energy is still there at times. It's just the films, there's just something, not sort of lacking a good example, like Wolf of Wall Street, I think is the best DiCaprio performance with Scorsese. But the film, I think if you want to talk about a film that's a retread of Goodfellas, that's the film you should criticize, not Casino.
Yeah, I haven't
For
seen
me,
it, so.
yeah. But Wolf of Wall Street is it's kind of like there's some there's a lot of kinetic energy to the film. There's actually some pretty good sequences, but the film as a whole just seems kind of pointless. It doesn't really have, and I think Gangs of New York I think does suffer from DiCaprio's performance and just being kind of overlong and without a real good dramatic sense. Shutter Island, I think, is really a waste. And Shutter Island's a really good example of Scorsese not being able to edit. Like, Shutter Island should have been a 90-minute kind of Val Lupin homage, and it turns into this 2.5-hour thing that's just, to me, just doesn't work at all. Like I said, I like the 90s films much more than you do. I like Bringing Out the Dead quite a bit. I like it as a reworking of Taxi Driver. Even I don't see it as a retread. I think actually it's kind of a revision where he changes. He has like a more empathetic character in the lead role, and is trying to somebody who's trying to save people as opposed to committing violence. I like that. I think it's an interesting work, and like Marshall said, Age of Innocence I like quite a bit. I'm more of a fan of Casino. Kundun, doesn't work as the story really drags quite a bit. But yeah, for me, it's really the 2000s work where there's not even The Departed. I'm not that big on, even though that's probably the film that works best since 2002. I think his best work of the last couple decades actually has been his documentary work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I like The Departed a lot. I mean, I liked the Japanese film that it was based on.
Hong Kong film.
Hong Kong film, yes, I'm sorry. How about if I say the Asian film it was based on? But The Departed I thought was really strong filmmaking, and it finally won him his Oscar. But yeah, I agree with you about Shutter Island and and Gangs of New York. I think that I liked Hugo. I thought Hugo was a big surprise to me. Was one of the very, very few, and I can count them on one hand or less, films that actually knew what to do with 3D. Plus it played to his strengths. It was about the history of cinema. It was very fanciful. It was much more fanciful than you expect from Scorsese. And then he turns around and makes The Wolf of Wall Street, which is basically an homage to excess. I remember watching that film. That long sequence where DiCaprio has taken the Quaaludes and is trying to get to his car, and I'm watching and thinking, this is so amazingly shot and edited, and to what end? It's basically a guy on drugs, and people on drugs are so boring that ultimately here's all of this technique, all of this talent put at the service of crap. And it made no point at all. And I just thought, why is he doing this? Why doesn't he focus on making documentaries? He can obviously get anybody he wants to talk to him. He made a great documentary about George Harrison. He made a terrific documentary about Elie Kazan. He did the Rolling Stones. I mean, the guy loves music, knows how to cut to music. So why does those are the better films than the last few years. I'm curious to see Silence when it comes out, just because. Again, it seems like a departure, and yet not a departure thematically. So, and him working with sort of different actors, a different generation of actors, it'll be interesting to see.
Well, Mark, let me ask you something, because Marshall had mentioned he thought that DiCaprio is so expressive. And I have to say, to me, DiCaprio is the anti-expressive. I saw him in his early roles as the Arthur Rimbaud character in The Basketball Diaries, in Titanic, obviously. He was in a Western with Sharon Stone, and then a few other films here and there. And these films, he always has that sort of constipated look on his face. He doesn't, to me, whenever he tries to emote, he gets that look that he's constipated on his face. And I'm like, this is just a little boy trying to act. And when I saw The Departed, and I'd seen him in a couple of roles, Mark Wahlberg was in an earlier film with DiCaprio, I forget what. To me, Mark Wahlberg should be the guy who's working consistently with Scorsese. To me, he's got much more of that street credibility. He's got much more expressiveness, and I think he's just a better actor than DiCaprio. What is your take on DiCaprio, and any comments on him versus Wahlberg?
It's a bold statement. I don't. I wouldn't agree with that. I don't think. Well, I think I like Mark Wahlberg in certain roles, but to me, he's very limited as an actor. You put him in Boogie Nights, he works perfectly. You put him in even something like The Fighter, he's quite good in. In his small role in The Departed.
Or Ted.
Yeah. And so, but yeah, DiCaprio. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of him, but I do think, and actually, I think he works. I don't think he works as his best performances are with Scorsese, though. Strangely enough, I don't think they've ever. Like I think Wolf of Wall Street's probably the best example, but like I said, the movie doesn't do much for me. His performance in The Departed is kind of interesting. It almost feels like he's in a different movie to me, and that's maybe my big critic. Like with The Departed, the thing I dislike about it is Nicholson and Nicholson's character and performance.
Yeah.
And
Nicholson's almost a parody. Nicholson's almost a parody, I think, of what an Irish gangster should be.
Yeah, and even like Damon's performance, I like Damon's performance, but it's much cooler, much distanced, much more distance. And DiCaprio, you can tell he's working really hard. He's emoting very hard, but it's almost feeling like he's acting in a very different style than the other actors, which you could say probably was intentional, and maybe the getting at these two different guys. The Matt Damon character who's very kind of detached, and it works, and kind of works out through their relationship with the female character, right? You can tell why the female character has an attraction to the kind of damaged DiCaprio character as opposed to Damon's. So I think the performance in The Departed is also a pretty good one, but it's again very much at odds with what's going on in the rest of the work. And yeah, I think for DiCaprio, I like other performances that he's given outside of Scorsese more so. I don't know if they've really worked together that well, but of course it's pretty clear why they're working together in some ways, because Scorsese has all of this cultural capital, right? Scorsese's the most recognized director of his generation, considered the greatest director, and it's clear DiCaprio wants some of that. And of course, Scorsese wants the economic capital DiCaprio brings.
Yeah.
DiCaprio, you can make if DiCaprio is in your movie, your budget goes up you can add $50 million to your budget pretty easily, right? So yeah, that seems to be their relationship. Even though there are people I know who like those performances, probably maybe more than I do, or definitely more than you do.
Well, let's end this segment, and in the final segment, I'll have you give your closing thoughts on Martin Scorsese, his life and career, and we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with Marshall Fine and Mark Raymond about the films and the career and the life of Martin Scorsese, and we just finished up talking about his films. Before I give you a final statement, I'll go Marshall and then Mark. Let me just ask you, before you sum up your thoughts, where do you rank Scorsese in the both American and filmic world canon? Do you think he's someone that's up there with the Kurosawas and the Bergmans and whatnot? How about you, Marshall?
Absolutely, I'd put him in the top 10 for certain. As certainly one of the great American directors, one of the great international directors. I think that he has a unique vision, and as I've said a couple times, just this excitement about making films that translates in every frame of the films.
And any final thoughts overall about his oeuvre, his career?
Well, it's hard to dip into his filmography and not find something that you want to watch. And I'm fascinated by the fact that here's Scorsese is at age 73, and you look on IMDb, and he's got like a dozen projects in various stages of development. Everything from an adaptation of Macbeth to a film that he's talked about for years about Frank Sinatra to a film about George Washington to an adaptation of the book The Devil in the White City. I mean, the guy doesn't quit. I wish he'd focus a little more and pick the right projects, and maybe even say, well, you know, I've made my films. I'll focus on documentaries, which are a whole different area, because he brings a whole different energy to those.
Yeah.
But the guy is absolutely one of my top 5 favorite filmmakers of all time.
Mark, where would you put him on sort of the both American film and the world cinema pantheon, and what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think top 10 might be a bit strong for me, even though definitely he's probably one of my 5 favorite filmmakers in terms of me getting into film. Like the first sort of 10 years or so, where I became an avid film fan, it was really Scorsese, Hitchcock, Howard Hawks, Ingmar Bergman, and Jean-Luc Godard. Those were the 5 that really kind of shaped me as a film goer. You know, but as I've kind of watched more films, and there's obviously more and more to experience, maybe Scorsese's gone down a little bit in my estimation, maybe because of his late career has not been as exciting to me as well. But overall, he's definitely one of the major filmmakers of, especially if you limit yourself to American filmmakers, I'd be pretty comfortable putting him in the top 10 there. And yeah, he's but again, like all filmmakers, I guess, have, you know, certain things that they're great at, and for Scorsese, it seemed to me he's just such a great fan of cinema himself, and knows cinema so well, and can kind of, and maybe he's one of the best directors at bringing that cinephilia and making movies that are both celebrating cinema, but also even at times being kind of critical of cinema and cinema traditions, or being sort of interrogating. And I really like that aspect of Scorsese. And yeah, in terms of sort of final thoughts, I mean, I think it's possible, like that Scorsese still has maybe a great film in him. Yeah, as Marshall mentioned, he's still, you know, working on all these projects, still has enthusiasm for the craft, but maybe it doesn't seem that it's it needs maybe more focus, or maybe more, or one particular project to sort of take on. But it seems that Scorsese, you know, what he's great at maybe is, you know, is maybe more of what we associate with younger filmmakers, this kind of massive energy, this great kind of technical kind of skill, and maybe he maybe hasn't aged as well as some other directors, maybe for that reason in terms of his output. It might just be the fact that he wants to maybe make these kind of big Hollywood films and isn't kind of challenging himself into sort of smaller projects or the kind of documentary work that he's very good at as well.
Well, for me, Wells and Kubrick are 1 and 1A, and you can put them either way as the top 2 American filmmakers. And I think Scorsese's there with Woody Allen and John Cassavetes and Coppola, especially the early Coppola, for the number 3 slot. But anyone who's enjoyed this conversation, I will link to the SUNY Press for Mark's book below this video, and also to Hollywood and Fine, which is Marshall's website. You can look at their stuff and contact them there. Again, I want to thank you for your time and expertise.
My pleasure.